Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the California Education Learning Lab's Equity Conversation Series. I'm Lark Park, I'm director of the Learning Lab, and I'm very pleased that we have Estela Bensimon as our guest speaker today to talk about the meaning of racial equity. Before I introduce Estela, I wanted to just say a word about the California Education Learning Lab because I think there are a lot of people here who are a new audience for us. So the California Education Learning Lab is a state-funded higher education grant program for California's public colleges and universities. We're administered by the Foundation for California Community Colleges in partnership with and on behalf of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Our grants serve the UCs, the CSUs, and the California Community Colleges. We've committed almost $18.5 million in funding over the 2 years we've been in operation. And we're really proud of the 30 projects we've funded, all of them intersegmental. We have about 160 PIs and co-PIs in our grant community, and we hope to expand our reach through our current open grant opportunity, Learning Lab Grand Challenge, Overcoming the Calculus Barrier to STEM Success. For anyone who's interested, at 2 p.m., we'll be hosting a virtual Q&A for that grant opportunity. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Estela Bensimon. Estela is no stranger to many of you. She's a national leader on racial equity in higher education and is the founding director of the Center for Urban Education at the Rossier School of Education at USC. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Education and a co-author of the recently published book, very smartly titled From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, Expanding Practitioner Knowledge for Racial Justice in Higher Education. She is also an advisor to the Learning Lab, and we're so pleased to be hosting this conversation with her. So Estela, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to first share my screen, and hello everyone out there. All right. So I am going to speak with you today about the meaning and practice of racial equity. And I think it's befitting that we should start out by reflecting for a moment on what has happened in the last 7 to 10 months. I think that one of the pandemics, as well as the racial reckoning that is going on in this country, has made it even more imperative that higher education as institutions and as faculty and leaders, that we consider how we can prepare our students to be anti-racist, and also what is it that we need to do to make sure that in our institutions we are able to provide a higher education that is equitable, particularly for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations. Clearly, the murder of Mr. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, have brought to light again how inequalities are essentially harming us nationally. And what's interesting is that as I was looking at these images, the images from the 1960s are not that different. In fact, they're quite similar. And here are students protesting, and here are students today protesting. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how could it be that here we are in 2020 and we are again in a situation that we experienced in the 1960s? So I think that part of the lesson for us here is that we need to come to terms with the fact that the way that we have been attempting to address racial inequity in higher education, at least, has not been effective, and that we need to find new and different ways. So I hope that I'll be able to share what those might be. So students in institutions of higher education have been protesting now for the last year or 2 years. And what's interesting, if you look at this figure, this table, is that one of their biggest demands is that they want more faculty diversity. And so they want faculty like Jennifer Ortiz, who is an English professor at West Los Angeles Community College. And if you're reading her bio here, I'm not going to go through it all, but she is a product of the neighborhoods where she actually teaches. And so she is able to identify with first generation Latinx and Black students. And she makes it a point of saying that, that her work is informed by principles of equity, justice, and, and the power of the personal narrative. And I'll be coming back to Jennifer later on in my presentation. But the fact is that most of our faculty are not Jennifers. They are more like Professor John. And if you have read the reports from the Campaign for College Opportunity, which look at the faculty in the community colleges as well as the CSU, and I think also the UCs, is that it's a predominantly white faculty. It's also a predominantly older faculty. And so they're more like Professor John. And we can think about, Professor John is a real person that I interviewed for one of my research projects. But he will speak about how his parents were college educated, how he went to college right from the start and went on to get his PhD, and will admit himself that even though he wishes that to be more successful with Latinx students, he is at a Hispanic serving universities, that he doesn't really know how to do that. And so what I am going to speak about is that the majority of our faculty are first generation equity practitioners. So we talk about students as being first generation students. And I think that we need to turn that around and think about one of the issues that we face is the education of first generation equity practitioners. And often these practitioners, like Professor John, they tend to be, or they claim to be, both colorblind and, to not really be, they will say things sometimes like, I don't see race. I treat everybody equally. And I hope to discuss why that is, in fact, part of the problem. So in your, later on, or sometime during the webinar, Lark and her colleagues will put some links into the chat, I think. And one of them will be this article, First Generation Equity Practitioners, Part of the Problem, which I published in Change magazine with James Gray, a math faculty member in the Community College of Aurora, who actually coined the term First Generation Equity Practitioner. And in this article, we featured some of the practices that I will be discussing today. So one of the first things that faculty who are first generation equity practitioners need to learn is the meaning of equity. So one of my concerns is that everybody uses the term equity, but often without substantive meaning or definition. So what I'm sharing here with you is the way that I define equity. I define it from a racial justice standpoint. One of the definitions for me is that equity is about corrective justice. And it's corrective justice for the educational debt that we owe to descendants of enslaved people, and other minoritized populations who were willfully and sometimes legally excluded from higher education. It's also a form of corrective justice. If you think about California, for instance, and we think about remedial education, both in community colleges and in four-year colleges. So for about 50 years, we have been putting students into remedial education courses that have no college credit. And these courses were established in the 60s, actually, when higher education became more open access. And it was as a way of saying these students are not really prepared. So we need to first prepare them before they can enter the college level courses. And what happened is that 80% here in California, about 80% of Black and Latinx students have been placed in those courses, and those courses became dead ends. So corrective justice is about also contemporary policies, which may have meant to do the good, but in fact actually ended up, as Ibrahim Kendi would say, begetting racist outcomes. So the second definition for me of equity is that it's an anti-racist project. We have to think about equity as being anti-racist, and that we need to be to work diligently to uncover the ways in which our institutions structurally, as well as in terms of practice, beliefs, and values, reduce racial inequity. And finally, the other definition that I use is one of decentering whiteness. Whiteness, even though we don't speak about it, is really the default in our curriculum, in our ways of thinking about merit, quality, and so forth. And so we need to decenter it. And part of that decentering is being able to recognize it and to speak about it. So oftentimes here in the United States and in other parts of the world, we think that we live in a world where everyone has equality in opportunity. And that's part of the American narrative, that we imagine that everyone, if they have, if they put the effort, they can go to college and be successful. But actually, it doesn't work that way. And those ladders to the diploma are not equal. So if you look at the ladder on the left, it's, some students do come in with a lot more resources that shorten their ladder. And I created this slide before the pandemic. If I was revising it now, I would put another block there and put digital resources, because having digital resources now is also another factor that is contributing to inequality, because the students who come from the far right ladder, most of them are facing challenges around being able to access online learning and a host of other obstacles to the way in which we are delivering higher education right now. So those students in the far right, and as you see, they come from way under, if you can see this slide. And they come, yes, they do come from schools that are poorly funded. Often they have been exposed to less skilled teachers. They don't have the advantages of counseling, because the counseling ratio is 1 to 1,000 here in California. And often their curriculum is truncated. And that is very relevant to the Learning Lab's agenda around calculus. Oftentimes, the students who come from those schools have not been exposed to mathematics and to sciences in the same way as students who come from wealthier schools. So the point of my slides is to say that that ladder on the far right is broken, and that it is broken, and it is, there are microaggressions, there is implicit bias, and the thing is that that ladder is a ladder for predominantly racially minoritized students, whereas the shorter ladder is a predominantly white ladder. So and so this is one of the things that we often don't. Sometimes we're very ahistorical in our understanding of education and particularly inequality. And we don't realize that the trajectory to that endpoint is not the same for African American, Latinx students, Indigenous students, as it is for the young man that you see at the bottom, where his trajectory is much straighter, and it doesn't have all of the blocks that will be affecting and have affected racially minoritized populations. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see it, Jim Crow, redlining, if you were listening to the video this morning, the death penalty, it impacts Black people much more, percentage-wise. And so if you're interested in understanding the history better, I highly recommend the new book by Isabel Wilkerson on a caste. It is a great way in which she presents the history of racism, but not just racism in the United States, but also anti-Semitism in Germany, and the shared characteristics. I'm sorry. I lost my, here it is. Okay, so I also want to say something about diversity. So oftentimes we use the term diversity interchangeably with equity, but diversity is something different. And so when we talk about diversity, oftentimes what we're saying is we're going to bring in more students into that broken ladder. So it's not just about bringing students, getting diversity, but it won't work if we don't fix that ladder. So what I will talk about today, after I get through the definitions of what I mean by racial equity, because I think it's really important to understand the meaning of racial equity as deeply as we can. But what I believe is that we have to create tools and practices that help leaders and practitioners fix that ladder, and fix it with the kinds of things that we know how to do, but we need to do them with a racial equity focus. We need to establish, we need to do data analysis, we need to set goals, we need to do professional development. And what I'm really going to talk about is that last one, inquiry. And I'm going to talk about inquiry as a method of bringing about changes in practices that eventually lead also to changes in mindsets. So I want to make this point also that equity, racial equity, has two dimensions. One is an accountability dimension, and the other one is a critical dimension. And but what I mean by accountability dimension has to do about numbers, and it's about proportion, using the concept of proportionality to have an accountability stance towards equity. So this is what I mean. So here is Math 101. And the point that I am trying to make in terms of accountability is that if a Math 101 course starts out with Latinx students making up 32% of that course, that in an ideal world where equity is possible, 32% of the students who earn an A in Math 101 will be Latinx as well. Typically, it's not. It's probably the Latinx part of the pie might be 10%, if that. So this is a practice that all of you out there in the audience can actually use to look at equity in your own courses in terms of grades or other characteristics. Now, the other part of equity, though, is the critical dimension, and this is the part that most people do not think. They don't think in terms of this critical perspective. They don't think about how our institutions of higher education are racialized, nor how our classrooms are racialized. But we need to, in order to bring about the changes that are necessary. So one of the ways in which I explain this aspect of equity is by using a sculpture that is in Copenhagen. And in this sculpture, what you see is you see a very frail man and you see a very heavy person on top of him. And there is this sculpture was built in Copenhagen to depict inequality in wealth in the world. And the inscription says, "I am sitting on the back of a man. He is sinking under the burden. I would do anything to help him except stepping down from his back." And the reason why I use this to explain the critical perspective of equity is because I think in higher education, we do something similar. So we will say we want more racially minoritized students to earn degrees. And we're implementing something like, for instance, pathways, which is a popular reform right now. We're implementing pathways to support them, but we are not going to consider how whiteness is implicated in those pathways. So my point is that when we think from a critical perspective, we cannot just think about a reform like pathways or AB 705 in the community colleges, which intends to dismantle remedial education. We need to also think about how whiteness in the practices around these reforms continue to reproduce the inequalities. And in the report that was just released by the California Acceleration Project, as well as PPIC, shows that, for instance, in remedial education, the racial gaps are not closing. And part of that is, I believe, is because we think of the reform only structurally, and we're not thinking about it pedagogically. So I'll skip this because I've already said that. And so let me just go to what equity is not. So a lot of people think that by disaggregating data by race and ethnicity, that they're doing equity. No, that's not true. You do have to disaggregate data, but you also need to know how to interrogate those data from a critical race perspective. It's not a tagline at the end of a sentence. And I see this all the time that is being put in as a tagline. It is not caring about all students. And it's definitely not about salvationism. And I say salvationism because often when we talk about Latinx, Black, Indigenous students, often it can be from a missionary pitying perspective. And that's not what equity is about. What it is about is that understanding that racial inequity has been created by faulty assumptions. One is the assumption of universalism. And what I mean by this is, and I see this in our institutions of higher education all the time, as well as nationally among intermediary organizations, is that there is this thinking that something, whether it's a reform, a best practice, will benefit all students. When we think of all students, that's where we go into decline, because all students typically, the imagined all students is typically a white student. That's the reference point. And also, and this is really important, if we actually focus our reforms based on the needs of racially minoritized students, they are much more likely to benefit all students than the other way around. And critical self-referencing. A lot of times people will use their own lived experience. Like I said, Professor John, going to college, educated parents, without really realizing that that's not necessarily the experience of their students. The faulty assumptions about why racial inequality, a lot of the assumptions are that racial inequality is caused by the deficits of those who are actually experiencing it. We have too much faith in our own anti-racism and therefore exonerate ourselves from being part of the problem. We lack racial literacy, and also the issue of hoarding power. Uh, Going back to the sculpture, I think that when we talk about racial equity and reforming our institutions of higher education, it threatens power, our power, either as individuals or collectively, and we don't want to give it up. So I'm going to come back now to Professor John and what he needs to learn. So Professor John needs to learn the left side of the column. He needs to become conscious, in fact, that he is white. And he needs to become conscious of how being white is something that maybe blinds him to the experience of his Latinx students in his science courses. And this goes for everybody. He needs to learn to use disaggregated data to identify racialized patterns of outcomes in his classes. So he needs to do what I showed you with the math course pie chart. He needs to make that a routine practice in his classes so he can monitor himself and ask himself, am I producing racial equity outcomes, or am I still being more successful with white students? And if that is so, why is that? He needs to be able to reflect on the racial consequences of taken for granted practices. So like, for instance, if he decides to do group work and tells the students to group themselves, that can have racial consequences because students, like faculty, also have racial assumptions, and they may view their Latinx or Black students as not as capable and exclude them. And this happens over and over again. I mean, I hear this all the time when I work with colleges. Professor John needs to learn how to use his power, his agency to benefit racially minoritized students. And in your links, there is an article that we will put about institutional agents. And it's an article that focuses on two Latinx STEM faculty who themselves were first generation. And it describes how they use their agency to help their Latinx students become scientists and develop an identity as a scientist. And finally, Professor John needs to learn how to view his classrooms as a racialized site of activity that is centered on whiteness, and that he needs to actually dismantle piece by piece by changing his practices. I'm not going to go through the lack of competence because you can probably have read it as I was speaking. I would say, though, on the right-hand side, the biggest problem that we have is viewing, we think of institutions and classrooms as neutral sites of activity, and they're not neutral. They are racialized. And most of our theories about change, particularly institutional change and transformation, do not take that into account. So how can we help Professor John develop that equity-minded competence? My work is grounded in the theory, it's a social cultural learning. It's called historical activity theory, CHAT, which essentially holds that institutional practices in any kind of organization, in a college, in a high school, in a hospital, and things such as hiring, teaching, leading, and so on, cannot be understood independently of social, cultural, political, and historical influences. So CHAT, the scholars who are the architects of CHAT have created this activity setting triangle. And if you look at this triangle, let me walk you through it. So if you look at the very top, there are artifacts. And that's where we are going to focus on for the rest of my presentation. Artifacts are the kinds of things that we use as practitioners to carry out our practice. So a syllabus is an artifact. And so is a grade book. And our language is also an artifact. Now, those artifacts are important because they're used by, if you look to the left of the triangle, by people, subjects. They're used by math faculty, they're used by deans, and so forth. And they're used in order to accomplish some objective or object. In our case, we're going to use artifacts to become equity-minded. And we need to become equity-minded in order to eliminate racial inequity. Now, in this activity setting, there are also rules. And so the rules that I am suggesting we need to create for our activity settings is rules that make focusing on racial equity a routine, a practice that we exercise automatically. And that we also, another rule is that we think in terms of best practitioners instead of best practices. The community here in this activity setting is, other faculty system, the CSU system, the community college system, and also students. And if you look at the division of labor, that's really important. The division of labor here, I have described that who calls out microaggressions, who calls out racism. And you see, the reason why I have it there is because often that burden falls on people who are themselves minoritized. And so we need to create activity settings where everyone feels the responsibility to call out, hey, we're skirting around race. Hey, we're talking about this without taking into consideration the experience or the needs or the circumstances of Latinx students or Black students. So I find this activity setting very useful for the work that I do because in particular the artifacts. One more thing about the activity setting that I want to make clear how it works. So in higher education, we have lots of data. We collect data all the time. And when it comes to the issue of student performance, we notice the gaps. And if you look at this slide, you see that the minuses, those are the minuses for Asian American students, Latinx, African Americans compared to the average. And so what we do is we jump to solutions. We have all kinds of solutions in our campuses that are based on our belief that we understand the problem that the data are showing, and we create those solutions. And what the work that I do is guided by the stance that, yes, I see those gaps and they are there, but I don't know why. I have no idea why those gaps exist. And so what we need to do is think in terms of this kind of paradigm, which I call the inquiry paradigm. When we see those gaps, we have to inquire into them, and particularly inquire them not in terms of what's wrong with the students, but what is faulty in our ways of doing things. So what I am going to suggest is that for Professor John to become equity minded, he is going to have to engage in inquiry into his own courses. And I will talk about, so this is what we have created. We have created a whole bunch of tools that enable all the Professor Johns and Janes to examine their practices from a racial equity perspective. And I'll show you some of it. So let me start out with language. So I consider language an artifact. I consider, in fact, some would say that it is one of the most important artifacts. And I just looked at my time, and I am going to actually skip this, and I'm going to go to something more quickly. I didn't realize that I was talking so much. Or I was talking too slowly. So here, I'm going to jump to another artifact here. So this is something that's, it's a great book. And we use this tool in Colorado with math faculty in the Colorado community colleges, where we had a major demonstration project funded by Teagle and Gates. And what you're seeing here is actually the grade book of a faculty member who I think we describe in the article on first generation equity practitioners. And what we had him do was, if you see the column where you would see the names of the students, instead they are substituted by the racial, ethnic identity of the student. And then we use different kinds of symbols to code submission of assignments, attendance, exams, and so forth. And what happened is that one professor who used this is that he was able to learn that his Latinx students were always in class. They hardly ever missed, but they were not submitting the homework. And the other thing that he realized, because we provided him with disaggregated data for his course, was that his belief that he had a 66% or 65% success rate in his course was actually wrong. The reason why he thought that was because white students had an 85% success rate and Latinx students had a 33% success rate. So what happened when he saw this is he did, so this is an artifact, remember? So he changed the practice of homework. Instead of telling students to do the homework at home, he started the homework in class, which gave students a sense that they could complete it. But he also did other things. And one of the things that he did was he made it a point to get to know his Latinx students on a more personal level. And when he did that, it changed the relationship between him and the students and the classroom culture. The end of the story is that the outcomes for Latinx students went from 33% to 85%. So some of you in the audience may be thinking, you have no way of knowing that those changes, that those outcomes were because of the changes he made. And I will say, yes, that is true. Many other things could have happened. But what's important is that Jason believes that that's what happened. And because he believes that, his practices and his ways of thinking about Latinx students have changed. And he has been able to sustain those outcomes semester after semester. So I'm not going to go into why this activity is important. I hope that you are able to see why it is and that you might think about doing it yourselves. So I'm going to come back to Jennifer now. And one of the tools that we have is around the syllabus, and how the syllabus can be a tool to demystify rules for students, how to be welcoming, how to create a partnership with students. So the syllabus for us is extremely important. And I'm going to show you very quickly what this is a tool that we have, and we are going to post in the chat the link to the website where we have all of the tools that are related to equity-minded teaching. So what I'm going to show you, and this is ideally what Professor John and James would do also, is something that Jennifer learned to do through our institutes. So this is what she sends to her students before the class starts.
Hello, if you're receiving this message, it is because you are registered for one of my English classes. My name is Professor Ortiz, pronouns she, her, hers, and I want to welcome you to fall semester 2020. Before we get started, I just want to say that I am so humbled by the fact that you are here today. I can't imagine what it's like to be a college student during a pandemic. It's been very difficult for all of us. And so, I hope that when things get difficult this semester, we will show each other grace. You're going to need something to take notes with. I'm about to give you some important information. The first piece of information is that the fall semester begins August 31st. That is the first day of fall semester. Our classes are taught 100% online, which means that your materials are going to be uploaded onto Canvas. That is our learning platform. Your class might have a different start date. Take a look at your schedule. Make sure you know when the official first day of class is for your specific.
So the point of this is that Jennifer establishes a welcoming relationship with her students from the very start. She also does other things. All of her materials for her class.
Hello, if you're receiving this message, it is because you
all of the materials.
She, her, hers, and I want to welcome you to fall.
Okay, let's see if I can go back. Okay. So all of the materials for her class are free, and they're all in Canva. And so that's another way in which she meets the needs of her students. And I'm not going to show you this. She also posts for her students in her, she has her own YouTube channel. These are students in her class who share with the incoming students what their experience was in the classroom. And if you follow the research that has come out of Berkeley, in the fact that when students hear from others like themselves, they're much more likely to feel like they can be successful. Well, here she is putting that into practice in her own course. So,
hello, everyone.
Oops. Okay. I am going to, I don't know, Lark, let me ask you this. Are there questions?
There are a few questions that have been typed into the Q&A box, and some of them are technical, which we can dispense with quickly, and the others are more substantive. So perhaps, Estela, if you want to wrap up in a few minutes, then we can answer the questions in the Q&A and then invite more questions.
Okay, well, so all I would wrap up with is, some of the mistakes around approaching racial equity in the classroom. It's, there's that assumption that if we're not overtly racist, then we're doing the right thing. And that's really not the case. We have to learn how to think about how to actually be anti-racist. I already said this, assuming that initiatives are good for all students. And if I would have shown you the language exercise, we actually have leaders in particular go through their strategic plans using our language tool to be able to assess whether they're using deficit, diversity, or equity-minded language. And I'm using that also with philanthropic organizations that want to bring more of a racial equity focus into their grants making. you know, the idea that color blindness is a virtue. If you say that you're colorblind, you're saying essentially, I'm not seeing, you know, the students who are Latinx, who are African American. And anyway, it's impossible to be colorblind unless you're medically been diagnosed in that manner. And so some of you in the audience may be thinking, well, race is a socially constructed concept. Yes, it is, but it doesn't mean that people's lives are still not impacted by what others assume based on the color of their skin. The fourth mistake is wanting to talk about low income rather than about racial equity. I hear this all the time. And so the thing is that the origins of inequalities based on income are not the same as the origins of inequalities based on race. And I mentioned the Isabel Wilkerson book earlier. One of the great points that she makes is you can get away from low income, but you can never get away from color, race. And then, the other thing is, you know, claiming to care about racial equity and then initiating, programs to honor Black Lives Matter. We have seen a lot of that in our institutions. But again, if you go back to my sculpture saying, I care about Black Lives Matter, but not being willing to bring about the structural and power changes that need to be made. And I'll stop here. You know, I have to say to all of you out there, it is really hard to talk like this and not be able to see you. And I try to pretend that I see you. And but anyway, so I'll turn to some questions now, Lark. And do you want me to look at them?
No, we'll read them aloud to you, but just for the audience. So we're opening up the Q&A portion now. I know that some of you have already typed in your questions. I wanted to just note, though, that you can use upvoting, which some of you have used to agree with the question or to say sort of me too on the question. And so a few questions have been about, is this recording going to be available? Yes, it is. We're going to send it out to all registrants, as well as post it on our RFP calearninglab.org page. Quite a few people, though, are interested in the slides. We are not going to share the slides. There was a question, though, about whether any of the infographics are available on the Center for Urban Education website, Estela. Is that?
Some of them are, yes. So if you go to our microsite on Q Equity Tools, you will see, for instance, the ladders that I showed. Those are there. And there is a lot there that you can, draw from. Yeah.
Great. And so Nancy, can you help us out in reading some of the more substantive questions for Estela to answer?
Sure, and thank you, Dr. Bensimon, for that questions. There's a lot of good questions in the chat. One question that rose to the top was one from Josh Franco. He mentions faculty of color attract students of color. So is there a double responsibility of succeeding in our professional experience and in the classroom for our students? What are some strategies for balancing these complementary but challenging responsibilities?
Yeah, I think that Josh Franco is correct. That that faculty of color, Black faculty, Latinx faculty, Indigenous faculty are often they suffer a racial tax, and which is the tax that comes from being asked to take on those extra roles of working with students who see themselves in that faculty member. And I know that from my own personal experience, if we were to look at the PhD students who have finished at the School of Education at USC, where I teach, you would see that I carry a very big load of those PhD students who are Black and Latinx, because they are attracted, they see me as a Latina first, and also because of the work that I do. And so what that all brings me to, Josh, is that one of the ways that institutions of higher education should deal with that is by, first of all, by counting that work and and being able to reward it. But for the most part, faculty annual evaluations do not look at that as something that is as a service and as teaching that you are doing. So all I can say is we need to be able to recognize it substantively and in a rigorous way, with proof. I hope I answered your question, Josh.
Nancy, can you go on to the next question for Estela?
Absolutely. Consuela asks, hello. She's asking about a little more, if you can expand on anti-racist pedagogy and dispositions as a solution to equity gaps. So she wanted to be prepared to answer questions from her colleagues about anti-racist pedagogy.
Well, I would say that you start with anti-racist pedagogy by doing some of the things that I have mentioned. But I think that one strategy is, if you look at your course level data, like I showed, is to be able to say, oh, Black students are just not performing well in my class. Is to say, why is it that the way that I teach calculus is not successful with Black students? So part of anti-racist pedagogy is turning to yourself and your own practices and how those are in fact contributing to those gaps that you are gazing at. I would say that the material for the courses, and ask yourself, in these readings or in these assignments, will Black and Latinx and Indigenous students see themselves? And I haven't, and you're probably thinking, she hasn't said anything about Asian Americans. And in terms of Asian American students, it is very important to actually focus on those who have become more marginal, Vietnamese students, for instance, Native Hawaiian students. So they are also impacted by these practices. I don't have a script for how to engage in anti-racist pedagogy, but I would say that those are some of the things. I would also say reading books like the new book by Danny Solorzano and his colleague on microaggressions in the classroom, reading Carola Suarez Orozco's chapter on microaggressions in community college classrooms, reading the new book by Gil Conches and I think Nancy Acevedo on Chicanos and Chicanas in higher education. In great part is exposing ourselves to literatures that often we don't think are relevant to us.
Thank you, Estela. I did want to ask you to stop screen sharing so that you would look
yes.
bigger and on the webinar.
Sorry. Yes.
No problem.
Okay.
And then Nancy, can you get to the next question? And I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more quick ones.
Sure. I saw a question in the chat about just anecdotally sharing that they've seen examples of students going through remedial courses and having success. Could you talk a little bit about some of the data behind the statement that remediation, and I know we can put in the chat some of the community college data because there's quite a lot of it, but anything else you would add, Estela, about remediation as an equity practice?
No, I don't think of remediation as an equity practice at all. I think that remediation came out of a mindset that thought that by having more open access, starting out, with the CUNY system, City University of New York, in the 60s, that with open access, students who were unprepared were being let in, and therefore remedial education came from that mindset. And the courses in remedial education, instead of teaching to the future, teaching the students what they, how to succeed in the college level math course, often were teaching, particularly mathematics, to the past. And not only that, but most of those courses were taught by adjunct faculty, many who, I said salvationism before, who saw their students in that way. Obviously, I'm making perhaps a lot of generalizations, but in the whole, remedial education has been extremely harmful to the success, to degree attainment for Black and Latinx students and Indigenous students, because they rarely ever got out of those courses. They became like warehoused in those courses. And the data that we have here in California underscores that. Very few, not only that, but faculty started out with one remedial course, and in some colleges, remedial courses were as many as 5 before you could get to the college level course. So a very harmful practice. And you also, if you look at the data from the recently released reports by the California Acceleration Project, by PPIC, by Wheelhouse, you will see that we're still contending with gaps, even though we're trying to reform remedial education in the community colleges.
I also see there's one question in the chat about how you address Prop 209 within the focus on naming race in your equity work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't worry about it. And why don't I worry about it? Because Prop 209 was about, preferential, it was about admissions. And Lark probably knows a lot more about this from the UC system perspective. But it wasn't about, there is no prohibition to look at data by race and ethnicity. Nor is there any prohibition to talk about racialization in the classroom. And so I don't worry about it. And I think that when people bring up Proposition 209, I think that it is more of as a prop to not address racial equity. And I also don't worry about President Trump's dictum on no more diversity training. I think that, the sad thing about this is not many people are going to care about this, my talking about this, when I'm talking about community colleges or other institutions. When it came to affirmative action and Prop 209, what they cared about were selective institutions like the UC system. And that's also an issue of power, going back to my sculpture.
Estela, thank you so much for being here with us today. Very thought-provoking talk, and people really loved the graphics and desperately want the slides, but we're going to send them the webinar link instead. I also want to thank all the attendees for participating in this webinar today, and in many cases helping us to spread the word. Before we let you go, I just wanted to remind everyone that this is the first in a 4-part equity conversation series. The next one will be on Friday, January 15th from 12 to 1 p.m. and it is on understanding data as an equity practice. Dr. Lindsay Malcolm-Pecue, who is the Chief Institutional Research Officer at Caltech, will be talking about what data matter and why, elaborating on the things that Estela spoke on today, and how faculty can use data to improve the classroom experience as well as the academic success of racially minoritized students in higher education. So we hope you'll all sign up for that meeting. Lastly, we'd appreciate if you could fill out our 2-question poll that's going to pop up right now before you go. That's just going to give us some feedback. And we, again, I just really want to thank you for your interest in the topic of racial equity. Please sign up for our listserv if you'd like to receive announcements about our events and grant opportunities. And again, Estela, thanks so much to you for, oh, go ahead, please.
Yes, so I would like to say to Alexander, Alex Stinko, send me an email, and anyone else that wishes to ask, has a question that was not answered, please send me an email, and you can find me very easily, bensimon@usc.edu. But if you Google me, you will find me.
Thank you so much, Estela. Again, a wonderful, thought-provoking conversation about the meaning of racial equity. We look forward to seeing you at our next event, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again.